Michelle Bishop, sitting on a patio with a lovely park behind her.
Hey, all you cool cats and kittens. It's Michelle Bishop, NDRN's voting rights specialist. Still, working from home, which I assume all of you are still doing, unless, of course, you live in the state of Georgia, which, if my local news has taught me anything, it's that all of you are currently going bowling and getting tattooed as I record this video. So have fun with that, y'all. Bowl a strike for me. So welcome to the second of our socially distanced fireside chats. I know what you're thinking. I'm not even anywhere near the fireplace right now, and that's a fair assessment, but for the first time, and I can't even tell you when, it is not raining in Northern Virginia, so I am going to be outside. In my defense, we are actually on the other side of the fireplace right now, so maybe just, go with it. Been home for 2 months now. Let me have this. So let's talk about the thing that I know all of you are actually concerned about, and it's not how close I'm sitting to my fireplace, but the accessibility of vote by mail. I have gotten call after call about this from all of you, and well, that's pretty on point as far as we can tell. We still have no idea if or when there will be polling places throughout the rest of this election cycle. That's really anyone's guess for the remainder of the primaries that we have left to go, as well as November itself. So let's talk through some of the basics. And remember, I'm always here and happy to talk about this, as are some of your colleagues who are actually working in vote by mail states. All right. If you don't already have a pretty robust absentee voting program or vote by mail, this is going to take a little bit of setup on the back end. That's worth talking about with your elections officials. Now, it's not really the P&A's problem, and it's certainly not the problem of any of the voters, but it is something that we do want our elections officials to have fully thought through if we want this to go well and work for all of the voters. Any state that doesn't have high capacity tabulators to be able to process all of those ballots are going to need that. They're going to have to think through how they're going to scan any ballots that don't conform to the remainder of the ballots. And we'll get into why that might happen. But in those cases, often the elections officials actually take a ballot that doesn't look like the others and hand copy it onto a ballot that does, so that it can be put into the tabulators with all the other ballots. In the case of an extreme increase in the number of vote by mail ballots that you're going to receive, that just may not be possible. They also need to think about any states that have any sort of request or application process for absentee or vote by mail ballots really need to think this through. And really consider whether or not they should automatically mail the ballot to all voters, because they may not have the capacity to handle the sheer number of requests that they're going to get. Often they can handle a certain percentage of voters requesting absentee ballots, but when we're probably looking at the vast majority, they may not literally just have the staffing capacity to receive and process all those requests. We already know that there were voters in Wisconsin that did not receive absentee ballots in time, although they had requested them. And they had to make the very difficult choice to either go and vote in person at their own risk during a global pandemic, or to give up their vote. No one should have to make that choice. If it comes down to it, states should err on the side of automatically mailing out all those ballots. That may sound a little extreme to some of you, but it's actually a fairly common practice in vote by mail states. So they'll have some good pointers on how to make it work. They're also going to have to think about supplies immediately, like return ballot envelopes, which could be in short supply. Manufacturers actually have to be able to create enough and get them out to everyone. They need to be thinking about that now, even all the way through November, to make sure they're going to have everything they need. Best practice involves including a postage paid return envelope, especially during a pandemic when voters can't necessarily go out and get those stamps. We already know that there are certain voters, particularly younger voters, who are just less likely to own stamps, including yours truly. But for a lot of voters, going and getting those stamps could be an issue. There may not be a post office in the immediate vicinity. There may not be accessible public transit to get you there. There's also a cost involved in buying that stamp, little as it may seem, that could be a big expense for someone depending on their income. So including a postage paid return envelope is generally a best practice, and especially during a pandemic when getting to the post office is an even bigger deal than it should be. Our recommended practice is to have a robust plan also for notifying voters of their options. This should include something in the mailer that goes out with the ballot to let voters know about alternative formats and alternate languages if that's not included in the original mailing. So say you have the option to receive your ballot electronically. That automatic mailed ballot should still go out, but something in that mailer should indicate that if this is not accessible to you, you have some other options. There should also, because that mailer in itself is not accessible, be a plan for local television, local radio, use of local print media and newspapers, as well as the election's official website to make all that information clear. They can also opt to communicate directly with voters. Typically, voter registration cards ask for phone numbers and email addresses, information that could be used to contact voters by call, text, or email to let them know what their options are as well in another format that's also more accessible than that mailed ballot. So your elections officials really should be thinking through how they're going to make sure voters know exactly what their options are, even if there's already a ballot on their way to their homes. So let's talk about how we make that actual ballot itself more accessible. One of the major drawbacks to vote by mail is that it typically relies on hand marking a paper ballot. Now, you know as well as I do that if that paper ballot is not accessible to me at my polling place, it's not accessible to me at my kitchen table either. If a blind voter goes into their polling place and they can't privately and independently hand mark that paper ballot, they don't magically become sighted when they go home, which means they can't do it at home either. Now, this becomes particularly critical in the context of COVID-19, where a voter who's voting from home who might need assistance to hand mark that paper ballot could be quarantining, could be under stay-at-home orders and live alone. They may not have access to an assistant to help them mark that ballot, which means, quite frankly, vote by mail always should be fully accessible, but it's even more critical now in the context of COVID-19, where assistance may be unavailable to some voters. So electronic ballot delivery has been the primary fix for that. It's common in vote by mail states, and there are some other states that are just maybe a little bit ahead of the curve, like shout out to you, Maryland, who already have something like this. Now, it's not a comprehensive solution. Most of the options that we see out there aren't fully accessible, and I have some concerns about all of them. So let's talk it through. The most common option is electronic delivery of a blank ballot that you either receive through an email or have a link where you can log into a portal. You're able to complete that ballot electronically, which means you use your computer or your tablet or whatever that it is you have at home to access that ballot and mark it using whatever AT you need. Perhaps you are going to hook your Sip and Puff up to your computer, or you just need it to read you the audio ballot. So you can mark that ballot presumably privately and independently. The most common version of these systems require that when you're done marking the ballot, you actually print it out and you're returning a paper ballot just like other voters. Now, that's one of the reasons some voters could be returning a ballot that doesn't conform to a traditional ballot and might jam up a tabulator because everyone's printing on a different type of printer with a different quality of paper. But the other concern here is that that's exactly what makes it not fully accessible. If at some point I have to handle that paper, which not everyone could do, suppose I were a voter who's quadriplegic and I was using my Sip and Puff to be able to mark my ballot independently on my computer, what exactly am I going to do when that paper rolls off the printer and I have to be able to pick it up, fold it, put it in the envelope, and either mail it back or take it to a drop-off center? So it's not fully accessible. Now, there is a slightly more accessible option. There are electronic delivery systems that allow electronic return of a ballot as well. At no point do you have to print out a piece of paper. You're transmitting it back electronically as well. One of the most notable versions of this is mobile phone voting. You might have heard of the Votes app, Democracy Live Omni Ballot, those options that you can load onto a mobile phone. You actually mark and cast your ballot just that way without having to print out any paper. It's gotten a lot of notoriety in the news lately, so you may have seen something about it if it's not something that's in use in your state. It's not particularly common, although it is gaining traction. Now, this eliminates the paper of it all, which I suppose does make it more accessible. One of the things to check into that really concerns me here is that some of those systems tout that they print off a paper ballot on the back end. Your elections official actually receives a paper printout of the vote. That paper becomes the ballot of record. It's what's going to be counted, it's what's going to be stored, it's what's going to be used in a recount, and the voter never sees it. Now, you know my stance on this. A complete vote is marking, verifying and casting your ballot privately and independently. Anything that the voter can't verify privately and independently, to me, means you haven't completed your vote with full privacy and independence, and quite frankly, is a bit of a security threat in my mind. Now, you also guessed it. These systems are a little bit controversial from an election security perspective. Perspectives on a blank ballot delivery vary, but the election security community is pretty uniform in their belief that electronic return of a completed ballot is a security risk. So any states that have this or are looking to implement this should definitely anticipate that kind of pushback from the election security community and be ready to negotiate that. One last thing I want to say about any of these options is that they all require voters to have their own technology in their homes. I have to have a laptop or a tablet or a smartphone. And more than that, I have to have access to internet or cellular data service to be able to use them to complete my ballot. Now, that may not seem like a big deal to many of you, especially if you're working from home and currently watching this video, you probably have all those things, but there are many voters who don't have them. And internet and cellular data service are particularly troublesome in extremely rural areas and on Native American reservations. Now, that's just not how we run elections in the United States. The onus is really on the government to be able to provide whatever it is the voter needs to be able to complete their ballots. You've never gone to vote in person, even when you're hand marking a paper ballot, and been asked to bring your own Sharpie or pen or whatever it is that you need. The government provides that for you. So any solution that relies on the voter having their own tech and their own internet access, to me, is a little bit troublesome. Now, I'll say, these solutions, although they may not give you full ADA compliance and they may not be completely accessible, are certainly better than nothing. They may not work for all voters, but they're definitely going to make vote by mail work for some voters. And there's a lot of value to that, especially right now. Any states or jurisdictions that are considering holding any form of in-person voting, it behooves them to make sure that as many people as possible opt to vote by mail. The only way to keep those in-person voting options safe is to limit the number of people who choose to use them. We have to be able to sanitize in between voters, and we have to be able to keep our voters 6 feet apart. Let's take a cue from Wisconsin, where in an effort to socially distance the lines, some people were waiting several city blocks away from the polling place they were trying to get into, and that's just less than ideal and very difficult to make safe. If we need as many people as possible to opt to vote by mail, then we need vote by mail to be accessible as possible, so it actually is an option for as many voters as we can guarantee. So for the voters for whom this is going to work, that's going to play in our favor. Also, I would say, if you're talking to any states who are particularly concerned about the fact that vote by mail accessibility is suddenly getting a lot of attention, states who have done something to make their vote by mail as accessible as possible have put themselves in a much better position for, avoiding bad press and litigation. States who have done absolutely nothing to make their vote by mail as accessible as possible really are leaving themselves open to risk. Okay. Whew. That was the big heavy stuff, and we went quickly, so I hope that all makes sense. There's a couple other quick points that I want to hit on. There's some really easy things that states can also consider that are going to make their vote by mail work for more voters. Now, they may require a change in law. That depends on your state, but it's worth looking into. States should absolutely consider relaxing deadlines. Relaxing application deadlines, relaxing deadlines for receipt of the ballot to give voters a little more time. As I mentioned, I do think states should also consider completely waiving request or application processes and opening up vote by mail to anyone who chooses to use it. They should definitely not be requiring an excuse at this time. COVID-19 in itself is excuse enough to opt to vote by mail, in my opinion. They should also relax any of those more stringent requirements that some of your states have that can restrict access to vote by mail, like having to have a witness for your signature, or having to have a notary, having to get a doctor's note to attest that you're a person with a disability and that's why you're voting by mail. To be honest, I don't know that we need all of these regulations in the first place, but they're certainly harder to meet when we're in the midst of a global pandemic and everyone's under stay-at-home orders. They should definitely look at relaxing some of those rules right now so that as many people as choose to can vote by mail and make sure that our in-person voting options are as safe as possible. So that was a lot, but as I said, this is something we're talking about all the time on the discussion forums. Get on them. Ask your questions. Let's talk this all the way through. Also, let us know what you're planning to advocate for in your state, and let's talk about it. You should be thinking about advocating for more accessible vote by mail broadly, but you should also be thinking about how you can educate voters about their options for casting a ballot. So make sure when you're looking at the discussion forums, there is a thread for accessible vote by mail. There's a thread for COVID-19 in elections, but there's also a thread for virtual voter outreach, which may have some great ideas for you there about how you can do outreach to voters in the context of stay at home to make sure that they're ready to vote, they're excited to vote, and they know what their options are. So as I said, don't hesitate to reach out to me. Don't hesitate to reach out to our diligent P&A staff in those vote by mail states. And please get on the discussion forums. We're talking about this every day there, and we really need your voice. Everyone, please stay home, stay safe, wash your hands, and remember to vote in November. Thanks, y'all.